Today is Tuesday, November 20th, 2012. My name is Mark DePew, the Director of Oral History with the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. I'm in Plano, Illinois today with former Speaker Denny Hastert. Good morning, Mr. Speaker.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for your hospitality. It's a nice crisp fall day, just a couple days away from Thanksgiving. So let's start with a pleasant topic here, a question about what the family tradition has been for Thanksgiving.
Well, going back years ago, I mean, my family always got together, uncles and brothers and grandmothers and stuff. And I remember as a little kid going to Joliet, Illinois, and having Thanksgiving at my mother's mother, so my maternal grandmother's place. And she's an old German cook, and in later years, they moved out next to my family near Oswego, Illinois. And I remember when I was in high school, my mother was working with the restaurant. We had a restaurant, so my mother would be working and doing things. And so I basically kind of grew up at my grandmother's kitchen, so old German raw fried potatoes and sausage and specely and noodles and that kind of thing. So those are the memories I have of early Thanksgiving. And then as our family got older, I think most of our Thanksgivings when I was a younger, in my teens, were probably at my folks' home. And I had an aunt and uncle in Lockport, and occasionally we'd go over there. And then our family, we would go down to my wife's mother, down in Shipman, Illinois, where the family farm was. And we'd travel down there, Thanksgiving morning, and I remember driving down there, not being able to find a place to get a cup of coffee or getting gas, because everything was closed. So that trip from that almost 4-hour trip from Yorkville, Illinois to Shipman was always a interesting trip. But if we did it early enough, the kids were still half asleep, and we did a lot of traveling that way. And so we would spend Thanksgivings down there, to spend that weekend probably, usually down on the farm in Shipman. And then when our family started to grow up, we would do our Thanksgivings at home. And we still do, except now that my son has a daughter, his wife has 4 children, 2 of them around, or 3 of them that are either 2 years old or younger. It's easier for them to stay at their house. So my wife does a lot of the cooking, and my son would smoke the turkey or roast the turkey. And, my wife would do the dressing and everything else, and we'd take it over there and have Thanksgiving at their house. That's what we've done so far. But we spend some holidays up at the farm, our farm too, up in north of here. So.
Okay. Well, here's an abrupt change of topics. This last few days, the Chicago Tribune has featured front page articles on you, and here's the headline from Wednesday, November 14th, which is about right after the time you and I had last spoken. Public money, private business, former U.S. House Speaker Dennis Hastert, now a lobbyist, used his taxpayer-funded office for outside work, records show. Comments on that?
Yeah, well, that's typical, I say, yellow pulp journalism. And, I have an office. We've used it to basically schedule anything that I have to do. You need a scheduler. In the rules of the House, your scheduler has a great deal of flexibility in just maintaining a schedule. Somebody's got to say, where are you Wednesday morning at 7 o'clock, and where are you, Wednesday night at 8 o'clock? So you put the schedule together. The scheduler does that. And, we've done innumerable pro bono times in teaching across the state of Illinois, in universities and junior colleges and high schools, and I always felt that was important to do. We scheduled that through there. When I first left, I was on Advance Illinois, which is the educational issue. I was in taking a co-leadership with the president of Southern Illinois University and getting a capital bill done so that we could capture federal highway tax funds, and spent a lot of time doing that. And I was on this thing for Chicago to try to bring the Olympics to Illinois. And so, those types of things you had to schedule. And then I had office, I would go to Washington, so that time would be blanked out. My scheduler there had to talk to my scheduler here to see what time it was needed, so those schedules could be arranged. then, flights in and flights out. So all those things were all part of that. I mean, it was legitimate. And, I just think that the Chicago Tribune should have been looking at more important things.
I guess that was my next question. Why focus on you after a presidential election with the city of Chicago and the state of Illinois having a pretty poor reputation for corruption in the first place? Why focus on somebody who had retired several years before?
I guess I was easy pickings. I don't know, but I don't know. They just keep banging at me. If it's not one thing, it's another. But if they're trying to rewrite history or trying to replace your place in history, I don't know. But it's one of those things that if you're in this business, you just kind of have to have a thick hide on your back and go through it. And all you do, if you try to respond to what they're saying, all you do is throw more fuel on the flames.
Do you think during the time you were in Illinois politics, and that's the time frame we're obviously focusing on, that the press treated you fairly?
Yeah, you know what? I did a lot of local press, and your local press, does something. I mean, they're interested in what you're doing for the district, the people you're talking to, what your ideas are for the future. And so I've done a lot of stuff with local radio. So obviously out here we don't do local TV. If you're out in the far suburbs, you're never picked up by Chicago TV. They don't even know you exist out here, unless you do something hellacious, and then your front newspaper, but they'll pick it up. But other than that, it just never was very much involved. It was interesting. The first time I ran for Congress in 1986, that was the first time the Chicago Tribune started paying attention to me. And the guy that was a writer at that time, their political writer, was romantically involved with my opponent. And so I never figured I really got a very fair treatment in the press.
Remember the name?
Mary Lou Kearns was my opponent. I don't remember the guy's name.
But that was a Tribune reporter, you said.
Yeah, he was a Tribune reporter in 1986.
Well, let's go back to 1982. We finished off our last discussion with you winning that election. That was the second election you had, I believe, but it was also the one right after the redistricting in 1982. My question, where I wanted to start today, since we've already talked about the election, that was the first year that this cumulative voting process, which we talked about quite a bit last time, was no longer in effect. Did that change politics in terms of how you had to run for election?
Well, yeah. First of all, when you ran, you didn't run with you always ran in the primary. You always had primary opponents. But once you're in the primary, you're on that ballot by yourself. So you didn't have two other or another Republican running, and you didn't have with you, and you didn't really have two set Democrats. You had one Republican and one Democrat, and were able to go out there and make your case. And you weren't playing this numbers game. You had one county would give a straight shot for their guy, another county would give a straight shot for their person, and so you had all this, very difficult calculus going on to figure out, how you're going to win or go through the process. Now it was just candidate against candidate, party against party. I think it was a simpler way to campaign.
82 was also the year. The reason it's known in political circles in Illinois is because that was the year that Jim Thompson ran against Adlai Stevenson III for the first time. And it was an extremely close election that didn't get settled until into January timeframe. Do you remember much about that?
Yeah, I remember because I seem like I get involved in those kind of elections, not directly, but tangentially. And I remember going up to, I was invited to George Ryan's suite that night because George was running for lieutenant governor. Most of those first 2 years that I was in the legislature, Ryan was a candidate for lieutenant governor, and a woman by the name of Susan Catania was his opponent, who also was a Republican member of the House, and made for interesting internal politics, palace politics all the time. But anyway, I was invited up to Ryan's suite at the Hilton or someplace, I don't remember where, and to watch the returns. It was we didn't know. It was a very, very dire situation. Of course, Chicago politics has always been famous, but holding back his votes and then finding votes that nobody knew were ever there, and that was always a danger. I think people were quite focused on that. I remember guys like Ty Fainer, who at that time was Thompson's secretary of, or was attorney general. Those people are all over the elections. They were watching the polling situations, but you just didn't know. And most of the votes were in from downstate Illinois, but there were precincts in Chicago that you were just, you know, all of a sudden the voting boxes didn't show up, and things were very, very convoluted, and you just didn't know how the election was going to happen. And again, it did get drug out into January.
One of the results of that election, and maybe this is a result of both redistricting and cumulative voting, is that the Republicans in the House, Illinois House, lost their majority. Do you remember, was that a traumatic thing, or was that expected?
Well, first of all, when you had 3-member districts, you always had a minority. And especially in the city of Chicago, which there really weren't any Democrats anymore, they would play.
You mean Republicans?
Republicans anymore. They would play those games. For instance, the first mayor, I think we talked about, first Mayor Daley was elected as a Republican. He was there for 2 hours and crossed the aisle. So we had Republicans that I remember sitting around me and next to me and back of me in the old legislature. They would get up in their chair and look across the aisle and seeing a guy named Al Ronan would give us thumbs up or thumbs down. And so they were Republicans in name only, but they were really Democrats. And then there were a lot of pretty moderate Democrats from Chicago. Artie Telser and Pete Peters and those people were actually in Republican leadership. All those guys just disappeared. They're gone because of the cumulative voting situation. So, you know, that was, again, our margin to make us a Republican House. But in reality, it's very difficult to pass any real Republican legislation because we didn't really have the real majority. A lot of our guys would vote with the Democrats all the time. So the House became more partisan, became real Republicans. And the Democrats, incidentally, lost a lot of their independent-type Democrats, guys like Schneider from Naperville and a couple from, I remember there was a guy from Danville, and there was a guy from down near Centralia, Illinois, and, you know, who were just really independent. They were independent of the labor unions. They were really independent of they weren't county or city employees, and they were certainly independent of the Chicago machine. So, you know, they were a different voice, and after '82, that voice disappeared.
Do you remember much about the race for the new minority leader? Since George Ryan, as you said, is now the lieutenant governor, and he was the majority. He was the speaker before. It
was a big race, and he had about 4 different people running. Tom Ewing, who was my old friend, was running. Jack Davis, who sat behind me, was the secretary of the party in Will County, and I had a big part of Will County, so I had pressure there to support him. And of course, Lee Daniels was running. But I think those were the 3 main candidates, and Ewing was the guy who I really thought was the best guy, most even-tempered. Daniels, I had kind of a run-in. I told you the story about the legislative bill that he and another fellow brought up in the middle of the night, and we battled that bill and won. So, you know, he was a little bit askance. I did that for Ewing, who wasn't there. He was giving a speech that night. So, you know, I kind of earned my spurs going head-to-head with Lee Daniels, and so he wasn't my guy. He wasn't the guy I was supporting. But I did support Ewing, and I did support later on Jack Davis. I kind of had to split my loyalty a little bit both ways, but I ended up really being a Ewing guy. Daniels ended up winning, and he took Daniels, you know, kind of courted all the women. And I remember Jill Zwick and a whole bunch of those folks who were, I think Suzanne Deutschler and others end up being very definitely in the Daniels camp. And I think Daniels always kind of played it kind of coy during the ERA fight. So he got a lot of those more moderate women that the ERA was an important thing to him.
Were you okay once he was selected?
Yeah, I was okay. I got along with him. You know, we were on the opposite. I always say that palace politics is probably, whether the Illinois House or the U.S. Congress, palace politics is almost always the most treacherous politics, because people have long memories on where you were on this battle for leadership or where you were on that battle for leadership. And I don't know if people keep actual lists, but they keep those lists in their head for a long time. But I was a workhorse, so Daniels knew that I would be there. I would do the work for him. I wasn't close. I mean, Daniels had us in leadership. I mean, actually took Tom Ewing into the leadership. He and Ewing were housemates, so I mean, they had a long relationship, and or they shared a house in Springfield. And I remember Tim Johnson, who later came to Congress, and Penny Pullen, who was a very conservative Republican, were the John Halleck from Rockford, where Halleck was moderate, Pullen was pretty conservative, but they were the whips, and so he had his own organization, his own guys, and a guy named Sam Vinson, who was really kind of the Republican floor leader. He would take and debate all the bills that the Democrats would bring. And Sam was from downstate Illinois. I think he was from Clinton, Illinois, or in that area down there. But Sam was a very smart lawyer, very could argue both sides of an issue very easily. And so he was kind of the, I would say, the Daniels think tank, and certainly somebody that would merit interview of some time. But Sam, I think, practices law in Chicago today. But Sam is a consummate politician. He played all the games. Almost got beat by a woman by the name of Judy Kaler in the House race in '82. But Kaler, I don't know what happened, but I think Kaler went on to the Senate or something, state Senate. But that was a real battle. And so I think he and Kaler were in the same legislative district when they had the old house. I think that's
Vinson and Kaler?
Yeah. So anyway, there was always an animosity there. But anyway, that was pretty much Daniel's leadership team. But it was interesting because when Pete Peters left, I became his guy, actually Jim. We said yesterday went to Chicago and became the McPeer guy, Jim
Riley.
Jim Riley. So Jim Riley, when Pete Peters left, Jim Riley took his spot to be the head of appropriations for human services. There's two divisions in human services. So Riley took that spot. Riley was there for 6 or 7 months and then became Thompson's deputy governor.
Essentially his chief of staff, as I understand.
Yeah, right. And so when he did that, it opened up that spot. And, Daniels was the leader. They named me to take that spot. So it was an important spot to take in appropriations. And that kind of led me, and I was also on this committee that at the same time, it was a Sunset Commission. And, we started to do this work on public utilities and telephone rewrite. And I became the guy that did all the work. So I had some really, in that second term, I started to pick up some really heavy responsibilities. And I was also doing property tax reform that kind of spilled over from the first term. So I was doing really heavy work on property tax reform. I was doing all the public utility rewrite issues and learning about this, going to seminars and listening and finding out what all this stuff was. And then the telecom issue, which is the whole Judge Green decision that restructured the telephone system. It broke down AT&T into all the Bell systems and then all the bypass issues. So those were all big issues that I was working on, plus the appropriations. So, I mean, I really kind of been, the second term became kind of the workhorse.
Well, this is the time for you to put some modesty to the side here. How was it after just 2 years in the legislature, did you get all of these meaty, heavy lifting assignments, if you will?
Yeah, I really don't know. I mean, I remember George Ryan kind of leaned on me to step in and sit on the Rules Committee, which was really a leadership situation because I could be dependent on. I mean, if I said I was going to do something, I was going to do it, and I wasn't going to squish under pressure. But I think they found that the work I did, I was committed, I worked hard. I didn't hold animosities one way or another. After the elections were, House elections were over, they were over. And so I was willing to do that kind of work. So, I just ended up, I mean, why Daniels put me in that spot, I don't know, but he did. I mean, there's other people that he could have put there, or elevated, because I wasn't even on appropriations at that time. And was there other people that could have done the rewrite in Public Utility Act? Well, I had done a lot of the base work. One guy ended up going to Custra, who went to the state senate. He did a lot of that work with me. Ended up being a state senator, so he was off that, that commission. Another thing, Rich, somebody from, I think he was from down Danville or down southeast part of the state. He became a judge, so he was off that committee. Ellis Levin was on that committee, but nobody, either side of the aisle really trusted Ellis to do that kind of work and be even-handed. Dawn Clark Netsch was working with me. She was over on the Senate side. So, I just kind of ended up being the guy doing the work and set up this relationship. Greg Bush, who is the guy who was Greggbusch, became the guy who was my director of when I did that work. And we just spent a lot of hours doing it.
Well, this is probably a good time to ask this question. How much in politics depends on luck and on timing?
Well, that's a loaded question. I think you look at my political career, I had an old coaching philosophy, kind of coaching. I'd rather be, I had an assistant coach who I said, I'd rather be lucky than good any day. And I'm not sure that's exactly how you want to put it in politics, but I also believe that you make your own luck. And if you're there and in the fight and things happen to break your way, you would never get it unless you were there in the fight. And so a lot of this luck, if you're willing to do, I said the three things that are elements is exertion, energy, just getting there and doing it. Second thing is trust. If you build up that people trust you, that you're not going to turn on them, that you're not going to deviate from what you said, that your word was your bond, that brings you a long way. And then just being in the fray, being in the fight. And whether you're coaching and you got to have a team, you have to be ready. You have to do all the fundamentals. You have to teach all the technique and everything that you need. But if you're ready and in shape and your team is ready and things happen to break your way, it's because you're there, and you're ready. And I think politics is the kind of same way. If you're there, if you've done the work, if you build up the trust, if you have the energy to do the things, and you have the knowledge, that's the other issue. You have the knowledge to do things. You've spent the time, and people come back to you because you have the knowledge, and all of a sudden you've kind of built a niche for yourself, and things do break your way. So, I look at my first election. If I wouldn't have run in the primary, I would have never got the seat in the legislature. If I hadn't, gotten involved in fighting for an issue that as a freshman, first year freshman, on the appropriations. I don't know if it was my freshman year, or my freshman term, on the tax provisions. I would have never set up and got that notoriety that I would stand up and do something like that. If I hadn't done all the work on the whole rewrite of the Public Utility Act and Telephone Act, I wouldn't be in a position to do it. And if I hadn't shown that I would work and work with leadership and do the right things, I really wouldn't have gotten the nod to be the head of the appropriations. That was a significant appropriations seat because back then we had a Republican governor and you carried the bills. You had control of the bills. You had your name on the bill, even though it was a Democrat majority. And that didn't change, I think, until after '94 maybe. And but that was a very significant thing because you controlled the bills, and you had your whole amendment trail after the Democrats beefed up, increased spending. You always had your amendment trail, and the governor with his line item veto just go down that amendment trail and use that as your amendment trail to balance the bill because we worked off a balanced budget.
Does it work the same in the Illinois legislature as it does in the U.S. Congress, where the Illinois House has to originate the spending bills?
All spending bills start in the House of Representatives. That's in the Constitution.
There's another thing you just
Also,
alluded.
all the tax bills.
Yeah, you just alluded to that's certainly different from the U.S. Constitution, and you mentioned the governor's amendatory powers. And as I understand, he's got light item veto powers, and he also has an amendatory veto. Can you lay that out?
Well, a line item, you see, a governor can go down line by line and line. If a number says $532,000 and he wants to cut it back to $400,000 and can justify it, he'll cut it back to $400,000. He has that amendatory. If he wants to just cross out the whole line item veto, he can do that. It just eliminate the $582,000.
You think that's a good thing? Did it work well for Illinois?
Well, it worked well because under the Thompson administration, I think basically I wasn't there, but under the Edgar administration, I think for a good part of the Ryan administration, you know, that we worked under a balanced budget, and that's how we operated. And we didn't do any, you know, slick stuff. We also worked always to try to fund the pensions as highly as we could, and that was all part of the process. So, yeah, I think it did work because you were able to hold back spending. We actually balanced the budget, which was what the Constitution said we could do, and
The Illinois Constitution.
Illinois Constitution said we should do, and we abode by it.
Do you think it could have worked at the national level?
Yeah, I think so. The balanced budget amendment means it also is kind of tricky for Republicans, though. But if you can't balance your budget with spending, then you have to balance it with taxes. And I don't think Republicans ever wanted to stick their neck quite that far out on a chopping block because they didn't want to say, well, we do automatic taxes to balance a budget. So I think that's always been kind of a trick bag that Republicans didn't want to get into on the federal side.
But as I would understand it, a line item veto at the national level would work the same at the state level. It's essentially you're not adding things, you're just deleting things.
Right. And, you know, I would go as far as to say we ought to do an amendatory veto. You couldn't add on, but you could always subtract. So if you wanted to say something to the National Institute of Health and you think that somebody appropriated $2 billion to them for some research project, maybe you could get by with $1.5 billion or $0.8 billion, and you could you know, do a mandatory veto. We essentially did that.
Okay, we had an abrupt end here because a couple of the dogs came in and ended up unplugging us, but those things happen.
Oh, they want to be part of the interview.
Well, they ended up doing it. We were talking about, you were talking about some of the powers you had out at the U.S. level that you didn't necessarily have, or you didn't have at the U.S. level that you had at the state level.
Yeah, the president didn't have a line item veto, he didn't have a mandatory veto, but basically you work with the president, because I remember that was probably 2000, 1999 or 2000, and the budget was about 1% over what we wanted to be, a little bit, you know, different areas. And so I remember finally getting a hold of President Clinton, and he was in the back of a limousine in Ankara, Turkey. He had been on an African trip, ended up in Turkey, trying to get, and we were up against a deadline because I was thinking maybe Thanksgiving we're going to adjourn. And we couldn't get the budget done. So I tried to get a hold of the president, tried to get a meeting, couldn't, and he was off, then all of a sudden he was off in Africa and you couldn't get a hold of him. So I think I probably got a hold of his Secretary of Treasury or maybe his budget guy, which is incidentally the same budget guy that Obama has right now. And finally got a thing, I had a call at 2 o'clock in the morning Washington time to get the president in Ankara, Turkey, sometime either, I guess it was early the next morning, it was actually the same morning. But I finally got him in the back seat of a limousine. Hey, how are you doing? I'm doing fine, Mr. President. I said, well, what do we need to talk about? I said, well, you know, we got the budget coming up, and we're about, you know, so many million, 100 million over, and we need to balance it. And I propose that we just do a 1% across the board haircut. Well, you know, that 1%, that cuts a lot of ways. I don't know if we can do a 1%. Well, how about a 0.25%? I said, well, that's not going to work. We need to get back to this thing. And so we went back and forth with numbers. He was just pulling numbers off the top of his head, and so was I. So I finally, you know, this backseat conversation, which was 10,000 miles away, we finally agreed at 0.8623 or some number like that. And that's what we cut at, and then we did a across-the-board cut. And but that wasn't that much different than being upstairs with Howie Carroll, who was when I was in the state legislature, and we had to cut things, and we would banter numbers back and forth, and finally come up to a number. It might have been Howie's daughter's birthday, or those numbers that made up that birthday, or some thing that came to his mind. But that's what we ended up doing. Not usually on the most scientific way, but people said two things you don't want to watch made, and that's legislation and pork sausage. So, that's how we did it. But you can do that, and if you have a goal, you can work together and get those numbers down.
You had a wonderful story in the book where you say at one point in the story, zeros really count. And I wonder if you can lay that out for us. I think it illustrates what the point you made.
That was a great experience for me. Doris Carpeel was a great seatmate, fine lady from western suburbs. I think Itasca was actually the town that she was from, or the area that she was from. And Doris had a seat on the Appropriations Committee. Only we call it the Hardware Committee, so it was not the Human Services side, but it was agriculture and highways and Department of Conservation, those types of things. And so Doris was carrying her appropriation bills, and some of them were kind of rather small. But the one that I remember particularly was to fix the roof on the rabbit hutch at the state fairgrounds. Now, everybody really knew what a roof was. Everybody had a roof, and they had a pretty good idea of what it took to fix a roof. But this particular legislation was $15,000 to fix the roof on the rabbit hutch in Springfield at the state fairgrounds. And so her legislation came up, but I had the next bill. And my bill was for $2.3 billion for human services. Well, Doris gave up, and Mr. Speaker, I have this bill for $15,000, and it's fixed the roof on the rabbit hutch at State Fairground. Everybody kind of ha ha ha. And started like questions. Well, how do you know the rabbits aren't going to multiply? And all kinds of this kind of funny stuff that happens on the House floor. It was probably late at night or sometime, and so it was kind of a comic relief. But sometimes those type of debates end up, and I want to use the word pissy, but it's just kind of people really kind of get into this mood that this is a problem, and so the bill, she finally came up for a vote, and her bill went down. Can we take a time out? Okay. What was I talking about?
We're back on again.
Oh,
here.
So the bill, Doris Carpeel's bill comes up for $15,000 to fix the roof, and it goes down. She lost it. My gosh, here I am. This is $15,000. I have a bill for $2.3 billion for public aid for the state of Illinois for fiscal year 1983 or 84. I'm not sure exactly which year. So I get up and I said, and about the day before I bring this bill up, a guy named Greg Kohler, who was the director of public aid for state of Illinois, Koheler, I believe, Greg Kohler. He came out of the state of New York, so he's kind of a big, brusque guy, almost kind of had the appearance of Governor Christie, if you get an idea of what I'm talking about. And Odie, come here, don't bother. So anyway, Kohler comes into my office and just kind of New York brash saying, yeah, you cut too much out of my budget. You cut extra $6 million out of there. And, I can't get the federal matching funds. We need federal matching funds. You cut too much out of the budget. I said, well, the budget's on third reading. Now you come and talk to me about this? Why didn't you tell me 2 weeks ago? Well, you guys are cutting all this money, and I'm busy. I got all these people to worry about, and so I have to worry about you bastards over here in the legislature. I said, well, I'll tell you what. Bill's on third reading. I can't guarantee that I'm going to get your $6 million, and you might have to scrape out and find it someplace else for federal matching funds. But I'll try to do it the best I can. And so he kind of some remark and epithet, and he walks out of my door. And so bill comes up, and I said, Mr. Speaker, I have a bill for $2.3 billion for the public aid for the state of Illinois for the fiscal year 1984. And I ask unanimous consent that we move this bill from third reading to second reading, because the Director of Public Aid came in yesterday and said we cut $6 million too much out of this bill, and that we can't get our federal matching funds. And I would ask that we could add $6 million onto the face of this bill when it's on second reading. I said I ask unanimous consent. Well, anytime that, especially a public aid bill, anybody can stand up and say I'm against it. No objection. So the bill goes from third reading to second reading. I said, Mr. Speaker, I have a bill that's $3.2 billion, and as I said, I've been told by the Director of Public Aid that we need to add $6 million onto the face of this bill so that we can get our federal matching funds, and that we can provide for the services of public aid for the state of Illinois for the fiscal year 1984. I ask we amend it on our face. No objection. $6 million. I said, Mr. Speaker, I have now a bill for $2.36 billion, and I asked that we can move this bill from second reading to third reading, and I ask unanimous consent. No objection. Move it to third reading. I said, Mr. Speaker, I have a bill now for $3.26 billion for the federal for the public aid for the state of Illinois. It has enough money to get our federal matching funds. We added $6 million onto it. And incidentally, I had my staff work this out. If we changed this amount of money into $5 bills, you couldn't stack it under the dome of the Capitol. That's how much money that is. And I just wanted you to know how much money that is. And I ask that we move for passage of the bill. Bill goes up, passes, and almost in 45 seconds we pass a bill that, for $3.26 billion, that you couldn't pass a bill for $15,000, 10 minutes before. So I'm just saying that numbers do count. What happens in government sometimes, the numbers get so big that people just kind of fuzz over and they really don't get into it.
Yeah, well, just to clarify here, what you had in the book and what you just said was $3.2 billion, so that was the size of the bill. You mentioned
I'm trying to pull off the top of my head.
Sure.
What I said in the book is correct.
Okay, $3.2 billion. Well, and it's a great story, and all those zeros kind of get lost in the mix.
Well, yeah, it's just becomes so big. It's bad enough talking about millions, because most people have never had $1 million in their pocket or in their bank account or in anything. And when you start to cost billions, you start counting to $1 billion. I think today, 30 years from now, you'd probably finish counting. I mean, that's how much it is. It's just the proportion's so big. Then you start to talk about trillions, and people just don't. It has a concept. You can't conceive how much money that really is.
Well, the way that sometimes we try to explain it is you'll see figures for how much debt, your trillions of dollars of debt, and I think 16 plus now, and how much debt that represents for each citizen of the United States.
Yeah, right. But so you have to break it down to smaller numbers so everybody can understand it.
Okay, what I wanted to do now is to go back. We talked quite a bit about Lee Daniels.
And the point being,
okay,
that's why I made the illustration or the metaphor of breaking this down into $5 bills. The people understand $5 bills. But if there's so many $5 bills you couldn't put them in under the dome of the Capitol, then people can kind of begin to understand how much that is.
Let's go back again, and we were talking about Lee Daniels. Anything else you want to say about his style of leadership?
Lee was a very energetic guy. He wasn't too much on detail of stuff. He was just kind of let a lot of other people, he was a good person to let other people actually do the work in legislation. He was kind of a general overall manager, and he was a DuPage guy, so DuPage politics was important to him. His counterpart was Pate Phillip, who was kind of really a character. I mean, over on the Senate side, he's a legend in his own time. And I think Lee was a little bit always under the shadow of Pate, because Pate was there first, and Pate was kind of a more gregarious type of guy. But Lee was, interesting guy. You never exactly knew where he was going to come down on anything. So, he kind of kept you guessing all the time. And but you know, he never got locked into a position, so he could always negotiate too. So I mean, that's basically how he ran his shop.
Was he effective?
I think so. I think, but you know, when you're in a minority, you don't have a lot of cards to play. But we did have a Republican governor, so it gave you a lot of power. And of course, on the appropriation side, we had a lot of power because we ended up carrying the bills.
Okay. Well, the other person you have to talk about, if you're talking about the Illinois House, is Mike Madigan. And at that time, he did emerge as the outright, it was Bill Redmond, but now that Redmond is gone,
yeah.
It's Madigan.
Yeah, and Redmond was a minority leader, and in '82, Madigan became Speaker, and has held that position continually, except for 1994 to 96?
94 to 96.
Yeah. Which was probably some kind of a record in the state of Illinois, I know. And but you know, Madigan was a consummate politician. He came out of being chief of staff for, I think he was chief of staff for Mayor Daley. So he grew up on the South Side Democrat politics and understood the machine. He was very much a person who could deal with the Chicago machine and had the ability to do it. He was also, I think, a precinct. I don't know if he was a ward committeeman or not, but I think he might have been. I don't know if he still is, but at one time he was. The people that he built his leadership around were other people out of the Chicago machine. Guys like Marovich, who was grandfather was Mayor Daley's law partner, and the present leader of the Senate, whose grandfather was you know, one of Daley's cohorts, and a guy named Jim Keene, who was from the South Side. Keene was an old Chicago Daily name, and so all these guys were kind of second generation or even third generation, but they were, you know, the Cullertons, the Keenes, the Marovichs, you know, they were the guys who Madigan used to run. And then another guy who was very effective is Jim McPike, and Jim McPike was from down around East St. Louis, or actually not, but Granite City, that area. McPike was an Air Force Academy graduate, a jet plane pilot fighter during the Vietnam War. Very pro-union type of guy. That's what the community came out. But he ran a tight ship for and he was Madigan's floor leader. So you had really good people around him. Then he had, I'm trying to, a couple of guys that he used in the chair all the time were guys out of Chicago operation. I think they both became lawyers or judges in the Chicago circuit at later on. They moved up to do that. Alan, I want to say Grimovich or Grim.
We can get that into the transcript later on.
So anyway, you know, these were very. He ran a tight ship, but Daley Madigan was in the chair every once in a while. But I remember still watching him in the afternoon. I mean, he was just a skeleton of a guy. It didn't carry much meat on him, just kind of a wiry little Irishman. And you know, had always these sparkling blue eyes. So whenever you talked to him, boy, he just focused, kind of drilled you with those eyes. And he'd stand up on the podium when he was there with whoever was either presiding, or if he was presiding, he always had a parliamentarian right with him. And you know, he'd be eating an apple, so he'd be slicing his apple. This would be lunch. He'd stand up there eating his apple, watching everybody in the legislature, just kind of divining where they were and what they were doing and how he had to work with them. But he had these piercing blue eyes and this kind of almost a leprechaunish, you know, appearance in a sense. And but he was very effective. He would also be very ruthless, and you know, he would take guys out, and he built up a huge power machine. He was unique because basically Republicans used to go out and raise their own money. I mean, you do your own fundraisers, raise your own money, and run your own campaigns. Basically, Madigan's modus operandi, once he narrowed down the House, was that he raised all the money. So he really was effective in bringing lobbyists in and putting pressure on them to give to him, give the House campaign, not to him, but to the House campaign. And so he controlled basically all the campaign money. So if you were if you were a Democrat, and you really didn't fall into line with what Madigan did, one of the things that could happen to you is you didn't have your campaigns funded. Another thing, Madigan also became the state chairman, the Democrat chairman, which he's still the state Democrat chairman. Well, the Democrats tend to slate. Republicans kind of whoever's jumps in the pool, swims your life, and whoever survives survives. But Democrats actually slate, and another Democrat could win if he gets, or could run if he gets his nomination papers in and everything. But the party usually very effectively pushed those people out, and the party also was the organization that went out there and knocked on doors and delivered garbage cans and actually told people how to vote in the wards. And so if you didn't have the state party support, it was very difficult. You probably weren't going to get slated, and if you weren't going to get slated, you probably weren't going to run. So Daley was very effective or not Daley, I'm sorry. Madigan was very effective at not only controlling the dollars, he also controlled who his candidates were going to be. And if you didn't toe the line, in a sense, you weren't going to get slated. And so and it was just not the legislature, but it was also the Senate, it was also state parties. If you're going to run for governor or lieutenant governor or treasurer or whatever, he was the guy. And that helped make that happen. And he worked hand in hand with guys like Dick Mell and Mayor Daley for sure. He was really Daley's eyes and ears and voice in the legislature, and on both sides of the aisle, I think mostly. And Phil, he worked very closely. Phil Rock was also the same type of leader over in the Senate, but not quite as focused as Madigan, I would say. But when you dealt with Madigan, you always knew you were dealing with a man. He had the badge on.
With the man?
With the man.
You mentioned a couple of things here I wanted to pursue a little bit more. You said he'd take guys out. What did you mean by that?
I think his name was Griman, or Alan Griman. I think it was the guy who was the presiding. He took the chair a lot of the times, and then he ended up becoming a judge.
Okay.
When he took him out, it means that you weren't going to be there anymore. You weren't going to get slated. You're done. Slate somebody else for your office. They'll get the campaign money, and they'll get the slating, the nod.
One of the common criticisms you hear about Illinois politics for the last 10, 15 years is that there's an inordinate amount of power.
Take this just for a second.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Okay, I was just saying that one of the criticisms in Illinois is that there's too much power in the four tops being the four caucus leaders in the Illinois House and the Illinois Senate, and Mike Madigan being the top of those four generally. And you mentioned also that Madigan he was the fundraiser for the Democrat Party, and then he was the guy who was able to dole out the money to help people's campaigns. Was that something that he thought up himself, that he took upon himself?
I think it's something. It's if you control the money, you can kind of control who your candidates are and who's going to get elected, and that's a power base that certainly. Even as Speaker, I had the Republican campaign committee. I didn't say somebody was going to get this, but I raised that money for the campaign committee, and people raised their own money. But you also had a real influence on who you're going to support and who you weren't going to support, and it also meant that the person, whoever you supported, owed you allegiance. And so, in the way Madigan worked the thing, I mean, he's in a sense, in a Machiavellian way, a master politician. because he has almost complete control over his majority, because they all owe him allegiance on either being slated and or funding for their campaigns. And you know, a lot of those people, at least when I was there, and I don't know how much still exists, they also worked for the city. You know, they were garbage collectors or sewer inspectors or something, so they were pulling down a city salary at the same time and basically double dipping. And so he not only controlled their state portion, but they also controlled their paycheck coming in because of the city. And it's something I also found out when I was doing the Public Utility Act. There was never any, you know, Commonwealth Edison was always the bad guy. But, you know, Commonwealth Edison was a huge city area employer. And basically the Chicago Democratic machine fed their people into Commonwealth Edison. I mean, it was another place that they had jobs. And so, you know, when I was writing that Public Utility Act, I always had to be careful where Madigan was, and he wasn't going to do anything that really hurt Commonwealth Edison, but he had to do the public image of real reform. But always there was a substance that you kept Commonwealth Edison whole, because that was an employee base that was kind of the second layer of government employment, of patronage.
Would it be fair to say that Madigan didn't invent this notion of collecting money for the party and then dispersing it? He just perfected it?
I think he became a master of it.
Did he do a better job than Daniels and the Republicans?
Well, Daniels didn't control money. I mean, there was no, basically, at least when I was there was no money that came. There might have been a couple $100 here, a couple $100 there. But basically, you raised the money for your campaign, and you were responsible for it. And you know, you went to the places that you had to raise the money, either from your own constituent base, or you know, from PACs and those types of things that you had some influence with.
Why the difference between the way the Democrats were doing business, which seemed to be effective in terms of power and the number of people they had in the seats, versus the way the Republicans did?
Well, I think it's just a difference in the party. You know, a Republican Party is really a party of, in a sense, mavericks. I mean, they're people that were business people, or some of them were former mayors or politicians, but basically people who came out of the woodwork and decided for their own benefit and their own principles, and that they were going to raise their own money. Now, it was just part of the responsibility of running. You're going to run your campaign. If you ran a good campaign, you could raise the money to get your message out. If you couldn't, then tough luck. Somebody else will win that seat.
You realize with this last election, you realize this much better than I do, that the Democrats in Illinois are doing high fives.
Hey, Gene.
We're having a tough time there today.
It's okay.
That the Democrats right now over this last election are doing high fives and celebrating because they've got a supermajority in both the House and the Senate, and a lot of that goes back to Madigan being able to control these seats.
Well, not only that, he controlled the map.
He controlled the map.
Yeah, and even he did that in the congressional map, and the result was that we lost 5 Republican congressional seats, not because we had bad candidates, we had great candidates, but they didn't have the votes. And when you draw the map, you decide who gets the votes. And you can take a district that might be a 55% Republican district, take 10% of those Republicans out, put it in a district that was 70% Republican, make it 80% Republican, and then have a 45%, 65% or 55% Democrat edge, and even in places like DuPage County. And they did it this time. They did it in the North Shore, they did it in DuPage County. They did it in DuPage County 2 places, because they took both the Wall Street and the Judy Biggert seat because they gerrymandered the numbers. They didn't have the numbers. They did it with Dole because they packed the Republican area and took Republican numbers out of Dole, and took Democrats out of Jan Schakowsky's district and put them in Dole's district. So they changed the numbers. They did it in the East Quad City area with Bobby Schilling, where they picked up every Democrat area they could along the river, and gave him West Rockford, which was predominantly Democrat, and gave the other guy East Rockford, which was Republican. So they packed that district and diluted that district and packed the Republican district, which used to be my old district. And so, I mean, that's what they did. And they picked up 5 seats. Pretty nifty when you only got 19 seats, and now they did a shift of 5 seats.
So is it time for the Republicans to rethink their strategy and how to do fundraising and adopt some of the tactics that the Democrats use, or is it just in the DNA of how the Republicans are?
Well, I think it's part of the DNA of the organization. I mean, Republicans are never going to be so organized that they go into one state organization to do things. And, just the base of the Republican Party. I mean, the Republican Party, Madigan does a very good job of going out and basically milking the system, all the money in the system. Because if you want a bill passed in the Illinois legislature, you're going to have to make sure that you can walk in Mr. Madigan's door, or otherwise your bill is not going to get called, especially if it's a major piece of legislation and important to a quote-unquote industry type of thing. So, you have to make sure that he has the ability to fund his candidates and do the kinds of things that he has to do. I mean, that's just part of the process. And, you're closer to Springfield than I am. You know what happens there. And so that's part of it. Republicans just don't operate that way. First of all, we're such a divided party that we would get called on the carpet if we tried to run things like that. I mean, our constituency just wouldn't let us do it.
Well, let's shift from Madigan to the governor at the time, and you've talked about it a little bit, Jim Thompson. How would you describe his style?
Well, I think Jim Thompson, and I look back at it, and I always had a good relationship with Thompson, but I think he was probably the best governor that we've had that I can ever remember. I don't go back to, I can't remember back to Green and those guys, but I think Thompson, first of all, he had a long tenure at 14 years. And at 14 years, you can put a lot of things together and make a lot of things happen. But Thompson had a style which was very engaging. I mean, sometimes other governors would kind of step back and let things happen, or kind of not want to get their fingers in the fray. I mean, Edgar, in my opinion, never really wanted to face into controversy. I mean, he would kind of always step back and see how things played out. And when there was controversy, I mean, even he could have very well run for another term as governor, but there was some, a little bit of scandal in his thing, and he just didn't want to get involved with it, didn't run again. I mean, so he just kind of stepped away. Thompson, if there was a problem, he would step into it and try to solve it, bring the parties together, not in a forceful way, but he was kind of a domineering person, in a sense, a dominating personality. And again, he was the kind of guy that kind of took all the oxygen out of the room when he came into it. But he had the ability and the style of putting people together and getting things done. And you talk about the power of the 4 tops. Well, he could bring the 4 tops in a room and engineer an agreement. And I haven't seen any other governor do that very well since then.
You oftentimes hear stories about Governor Thompson actually going to the floor of the legislature. Do you have any stories like that?
Well,
you recall?
Look, he was strode into the legislature at 8 o'clock at night, or if there was an important piece of legislation or a piece of something that he wanted to get done. And, he would go in and talk to people. I think it's interesting. I haven't seen this film about Lincoln, but one of the things about Lincoln, this film, it talks about how Lincoln would do anything to make sure that he got his legislation done. He would engage people. He would talk to them. He would just leverage people on things. Well, Thompson was also the same way. I mean, he would make sure that he brought the right people into the room, that he talked to the right people, that he soothed over any conflict that people had, and he could put his arm around you and schmooze you a little bit, and you'd feel good. And he had the ability to do that, and he took the time and the effort to do it. There are people down in his office working on things, members of the legislature, all the time. He'd bring them down. If it was Highway 51 or if it was this, they'd bring the people down and they'd work the problems out. And part of that is how always the gap in the legislature is what you appropriate and what you do and then trying to bring the Secretary of Transportation or the Secretary of Health or the Secretary of this in to get the job done that you wanted to get done, the gap between the administration and the legislature. Thompson would close that gap. I mean, he would bring people over to the mansion. I mean, after hours, there would be times that you could come together and be a little party or get together, and you'd sit and talk about things and get things done. He had the knack of doing it. I think he was a great governor. You know, a lot of people like to take shots at Thompson and his lifestyle, or whether he had a happy marriage or he didn't have a happy marriage. But Thompson was a guy who was married to his job, and he carried that job up, I think, with great dignity, and a very effective person. Now, maybe I'm putting him on a pedestal, but I think he deserves to be looked at in that way.
You've mentioned a couple times the Public Utility Act that you had quite a hand in. I wonder if you can talk any specifics, if there's anything more you'd like to say about that legislation.
Well, the big problem with the Public Utility Act was, you had Commonwealth Edison, and then you had a couple other companies in Illinois, but there were basically 14 nuclear plants, 7 online and 7 coming online. Most of them are being built, and when they were first put on the drawing board, a plant supposed to cost maybe $400 or $500 million. Well, after the 3 Mile Island thing and all the changes happened, these plants all of a sudden cost $4 billion or $5 billion to build, and because the Illinois Commerce Commission basically, they were the ones that decided what the return on investment would be. And so the Illinois Commerce Commission basically would give these guys a 10% return on investment. Well, the problem was, if Commonwealth Edison was getting a 10% return on $500 million, that was one thing. But if they're getting a 10% return on $4 billion, that was another thing. And so all of a sudden there was no, even by the people, the companies that were building these things, there was no incentive to hold back the cost, because they would go out and finance, and then they get this huge return on investment and they also get a return on the cost of their finance. So it was kind of open door. And then you had this marriage between the Chicago democratic system and the patronage system, where a lot of the Commonwealth, so you had an incestuous relationship there. And I was kind of thrown in the middle. And one of the big things, one of the most controversial things, is that should Commonwealth Edison get a rate of return on excess capacity? And so a lot of us decided, we need to put our foot down on this whole issue of excess capacity, because if you had 14 nuclear plants, and again, let me tell you that we had Union Electric and we had Illinois Power, so there were other companies that had had some nuclear plants, but Commonwealth Edison had to probably have 70 or 80% of them. So if you're going to get 100% return on a plant that's only pumping out 40% capacity because you don't need it, there's not that much use. Should they get 40% return, or should they get 10% of the 40%, or should they get 10% of the 100%? So that was the big issue, and that was part of the things that we were writing into that bill, and that really became the controversial issue. And of course, nobody understood it, the lawyers could fudge it over, and the Democrats wanted to fudge it over, Madigan. So, and probably Daniels was kind of in the same boat. So it was really a struggle to find something that worked, that was fair, and was right, because we're really changing how the system was worked. And I think Thompson was on board. He understood what we were trying to do. When I finished that bill, we basically really changed the role of the Illinois Commerce Commission and how they operate, and how they staffed, and how the information was fed up into the system. And after that, Thompson pulled me down in his office. He said, "Look, I got this opening on being the chairman of the Commerce Commission. Do you want to do that?" I'm thinking to myself, no, I don't want to do that. It'd be a great job to move into, but I don't want to do it because, first of all, you probably need to be a lawyer to do that, and I'm not a lawyer, and I wasn't trained in that, and I wanted to if I was going to do something like that, I want to do it good. And then finally, you may serve. I was a young guy then. I was 38 years old, or maybe 36 years old at that time. And I was thinking, if I do something like that, you might be with 4 or 5 or 6 years, and you have to go and make your living off of that, doing something else and working for somebody. But you almost have to be a lawyer to take advantage. I wasn't a lawyer, so I just said, look, I don't think that's the right place for me to go, and I don't know what I like here in the legislature, and I just don't think that's what I want to do. So I said I wasn't going to do it.
How then was the formula changed? Was it changed so that it reflected they were only going to get 10% of the 40% that they were selling?
Yeah, that's all oversimplified. There was a formula, but what they produced, yeah. So we put an excess capacity standard in it. It was kind of a floating standard, so I'm not exactly how.
How did that issue break out in the two parties? Was it something the Democrats were typically opposed to?
Look, it was such an arcane issue that all that knowledge was, and some of the leaders that you knew, because they've been briefed by staff, knew what they're talking about. Most of the members just trusted you to do the right thing. They really didn't understand. And matter of fact, I remember McPike, when we moved the bill out of the House, we had a vote that was, it was 117 members, so I think it was a 58-59 vote, but it was a structured vote. They put 59 people on, we put 58 people on.
What does that mean, a structured vote? You pretty much knew who to rely on in the first place and what the right vote was for that particular district?
They lined up their people, which they could. Then we had to go find, it wasn't 58, 59, but whatever made the majority up that you passed the bill. But that's what it passed by, with probably 1 vote margin.
There's a name I need to enter into here right now. Pat Quinn is the current governor, but I believe during that time, he was something of a renegade. He was the guy behind the cumulative voting and the cutback amendment, but wasn't he also at this time the Public Utility Board, the power behind that?
Yeah, he was the power behind the Public Utility Board, and basically what it said is that it was Citizens Utility Board.
That's right, I'm sorry.
Board. And, he was an activist, and it gave him he constructed that, and it gave him a platform then to talk out of, and gave him a political platform. So what he did is create his own little political entity, with Public Action, who was a guy named Kramer, who is the husband of Jan Schakowsky, who ended up going to prison for, actually misusing funds. So, I mean, that was the kind of community those guys were. They were less than stellar.
Which side was the Citizens Utility Board on?
Well, ostensibly they're on the public side. They're a consumer group.
So for lower rates, which would factor into your side of the equation, I would think.
Yeah, but also you have to remember what Quinn was doing is creating the Public Utility Board, or Citizens Utility Board, to give himself his own political platform. So he was creating something for himself. It was very self-centered.
Okay. You also had talked about the telephone. I'm looking for the right way to phrase it.
Rewrite a Telephone Act. And what happened is this guy named Jack Gokin, who lived from Plainfield, Illinois, created this company, MCI. I don't know if that was the original name of it, but that's what it ended up being.
Jack Gokin?
G-O-E-K-E-N, Gokin. He was an inventor. He was an entrepreneur. So he created this bypass, this telephone bypass that, what ran the telephone companies was long distance. So, there's a philosophy in telecommunications was universal service. So Aunt Mary, who lived 70 miles south of Jacksonville, somebody would run a twisted wire out to her farm so she could talk to her nephews and nieces and call the hospital if there was an emergency. So I mean, this whole idea of universal service was basically what ran it. Long distance then was the thing that covered the cost. So most people didn't use long distance. Most people were party line, local businessmen. Your telephone. People who used long distance were the business people. So you're calling Los Angeles or Chicago or New York or Atlanta or Miami or whatever. you're using long distance. Well, your long distance fees then subsidize the cost of local service. So if you wanted a telephone, there'd be a little green truck that pulled up, brought you a telephone, hooked it up to your house, put the wires in, ran the wires from the pole to your house, and that was free. After the Telephone Act, all of a sudden that went away, and you had AT&T, where it broke up into 7 local agencies. You had Sprint and MCI and others that became the long distance carriers, and you could also get your long distance through AT&T. But you got a real discount because they bought this time in block and then discounted it and sent it, and so business had a different place to go to buy its long distance. So all of a sudden, local service had to carry its own weight. And so you did get a little green truck that brought your telephone out to you and hooked your wire up. If you wanted a telephone, you had to go to the store and buy it, or have to go to Walmart and buy your telephone and have somebody run the wires and hook it up. And if there was something wrong with your telephone service, the telephone company would come out there, but they'd charge you for it. So all of a sudden, this whole thing of long distance covering the cost of local service didn't exist. So you broke up the 2 entities. When you did, you opened up the whole area of telecom. Nobody had a PC, nobody had a cell phone, nobody had a BlackBerry, nobody had there was no internet, there was no web, didn't exist. But after you broke up the system, then all of a sudden this instant technology, people all of a sudden, well, you could have a radio phone, and you could go by and bypass and still go through the switch and connect. And so all these other new technologies sprang up in telecommunications. And then you had cable. Well, you found out that cable companies, they could take telephones, and they could not only give you television, but they could cable in to do your telephone and do your computer, and set up Wi-Fi in your house, and do all kinds of things, and give you special television service if you wanted it, or whatever. So all of a sudden you had another competition come in. It was called cable. And then all of a sudden you had the wireless systems and the little dishes that you put on. And if you had dish, they could bring in telephone, they could bring in TV, they could bring in cable, they could bring in Wi-Fi. So when you broke up the system of AT&T, not only did they control all the long distance, and there was other competitors, but there were small players out there in pockets. They had little niches. But AT&T controlled the long distance, and it controlled all the local. When you split it off, and you had this whole long distance things become competitive, AT&T still controlled the switches. So you had to make sure, and when we did the Telephone Act in '96 in the Congress, we made sure that they didn't overcharge for the ability for these companies to come in and switch their calls, going through the switch, so you can get a call from Chicago and be switched in Chicago or a call from New York into Chicago and be switched to Los Angeles, to get to the right number. So, that was the thing, and then all of a sudden, new technology with cell phones and stuff, you didn't even have to do the switch.
The way you're laying this out right now is that without the breaking up of AT&T, we would never have this explosion of innovation. Would that be fair assessment?
Absolutely. I think that opened up the door for innovation, because once you had a monopoly, there was never any incentive for innovation.
Okay. The other thing then is that you had a big part in writing this legislation in the state of Illinois. What specifically do you look at now? What were the contributions that you and the Republicans made in that?
Well, it was a bipartisan. I was a chairman of a House Joint Committee. It was both House and Senate, and on a bipartisan basis. So, we really kind of worked together. I worked with Jim McPike a lot to put this bill together. I mean, he was smart enough to understand what the issues were. Like I said, you get down into detail and nitty-gritty of this kind of stuff. Average member just trusts you to do the right thing. They don't understand all the intricacies of it. And so, you basically, we're almost doing this parallel with the Public Utility Act. So there's a lot of responsibility. And I was doing appropriations too. So, I remember when up in Howie Carroll's office, and it was like 1985 or maybe 86. I think it was 85. And we're just finishing all this legislation, and we're doing the appropriation. It was late June, right before. and my back went out, and I had to lay on the floor just to be. I was just, and then I thought I had a heart. Not a heart. I didn't have a heart condition, but they took me in, and I had kind of spells, and they put an EKG on me. I was just kind of overloaded. I was just doing a lot of stuff. I was stressed, I guess you'd call it today.
I want to make sure I understand the context here. This is the breakup of the telephone of AT&T. Was that something that occurred because of national legislation or
It was a court case. It was Judge Green decision.
And that was
and
at the federal level.
And it was filed in the 1970s, like 74, 75. Green took a long time to make the decision. He came down with a decision that AT&T had to disband.
Okay, so
so what the job of the legislature was, because this came up, and we had on the Sunset Commission, we had the ability to write this legislation, or the responsibility to do it. We actually laid the parameters on how it was going to work after it broke up.
You were ahead of quite a few other states then?
Yeah, I remember I went out to what do they call it, some of the state conference of state legislatures, NCSL, and others in this, both the conservative one and NCSL, and just told them how we did it. It was kind of how-to.
In other words, the state of Illinois set the standard for an awful lot of the other states.
Yeah, we were kind of the leader in that.
Okay. I don't know if this is one you want to address or not, but a farmland assessment bill.
Yeah.
And this is another one I think Jim McPike would factor into. It sounds
Oh
like.
yeah, he was just adamant against it. I was on a property tax issue, and what happened with farmers, the land's values in these areas were going up and up and up, and if you were taxed at a 33 1/3, all of a sudden your tax was more than what your crops would be. So, let's say your land was assessed at, I'm just pulling a number out of the air, but let's say you're assessed basically at $5,000 an acre. That was probably right for back then. Maybe $9,000 an acre in some places. But let's say your land was assessed at $5,000 an acre, and you were with real value, and so the assessed value then would be, well, let's say $6,000 an acre. Then your assessed value would be $2,000, and so if your taxes were 5%, basically what they were outside of the city of Chicago, if your taxes were basically 5% of your assessed valuation, then 5% of $2,000 would be $100, right? Yeah. So if you were getting, a bushel, and corn was $2 a bushel, and you're getting $100 if you're getting 100 bushels the acre, you're making $200 because you're planting and your diesel and your seed and everything else, and you're paying $100 tax. You couldn't farm. You follow me?
Right.
So what you had to do is keep the farmland down low enough that a farmer could make a living and pay his tax and wasn't taxed out of doing his business. So that's what farmland assessment was all about, to keep farmland, actually legitimate farmland, low enough that farmers could farm. And it was a big part of Illinois, agriculture was a big part of Illinois business.
So how did the fight transpire then?
Well, the McPike farmland assessment bill came down that farmers were getting a break that nobody else got, and it was unconstitutional, and farmers should never get this kind of, that's how McPike used to say it, farmers. Yeah, but then he'd talk about union guys going to work and punching a thing and getting so much money and paying their property taxes and everything, and they didn't get this kind of tax break. So that was the fight was about.
Okay, and we were successful in that one?
Yeah. Tom Ewing was really the guy that was kind of the leader on that. But
Well, I think I should ask you also about Frank Watson. Did he factor into that debate?
yeah, I think so, because he had yeah, he was involved in that. I think because he was a downstate guy, and McPike and Watson were kind of close geographically, so there's probably a little bit. And I think they shared some of the same media, so there's always a little political heat there.
Okay.
I don't know to what extent Frank. I don't think Frank was on that committee, but
Okay. You've already talked also about the Sunset Commission, and I understand came a point in time that you were on that commission, and that led to some important legislation that came out of there, but that there was a point in time when Madigan and Daniels wanted to end it?
Well, they did. As a matter of fact, it was interesting because there were a lot of commissions. And, there was the Recreation Commission, and there was the Sportsman's Commission, and there was the Child Abuse Commission, and there was this commission and that commission. So, what Madigan, all of a sudden, when a commission was set up, the guy who was the chairman of the commission, all of a sudden had his own little political empire. So he had a staff, and he had probably an office in Chicago, and so they decided between Madigan and Daniels themselves that look at all this money was going to these commissions, they should have that money, and they should have the ability to control that staff, because the leadership was all about controlling staff and controlling money. And ultimately they had the responsibility too, so I could see there was a two-sided side of that thing. But what they decided to do was to do away with the commissions, and then they took all the staff.
Apparently you weren't too crazy about the idea of sunsetting the Sunset Commission.
Well, they sunset the Sun Commission, and we weren't out there doing it. We're doing a lot of work. And we're doing the Public Utility Act, we're doing the Telephone Act, and we've done a lot of other stuff. So, I mean, it was really a legitimate, there was two-man commissioner. We had a staff, Greg Bush was a staffer on it, and we had another guy that we used to do a lot of the drafting, but that was it,
Okay. Well, I wanted to get to the political side of things. It's really all political when we talk about this, but talk a little bit about the '84 election. And I think when you mentioned the '82 election, you already set this up and saying the '84 election was a much easier one for you personally.
Yeah, it was, you had built a record. When I was in '82, I was running a lot of Will County that I had never represented. So I had Plainfield, Bolingbrook, and a lot of Troy Township, which is down in Will County, that I never had before. But once you're there and you set up your work, and I'd stop and see the police chief and the mayor and talk to them and see what was going on. I really spent a lot of time in my district when we weren't in session. And I was, in a sense, a full-time legislator. I did a lot of casework myself. I always said I was pretty good at casework when I came to Congress. And I told all my staff, look, I can do casework better than any of you, so you better do a good job. And because I did when I was a state legislator, I did almost all of my own casework. So people would call you about barking dogs, or their sewer system, or their lake was polluted in their backyard in a subdivision. It was your responsibility to find the answers to it. You might have to go to municipalities, you might have to go to counties, but you might go out and talk to federal people. I mean, some people didn't like the post office service they were getting, so they come to you. So I had to get a hold of the congressman and talk to him. Look, we've got a problem in this post office.
Okay. That was Reagan's year. He was up for re-election. You remember anything significant about that election?
You know what? I don't.
It was an awfully good year for the Republicans.
It was a great year for Republicans, and he had come out of this recession in '82 where we had a bad year. And I remember he came to Dixon, Illinois, but Judy Kaler was a representative for Dixon, and I remember we had another fellow who lived in Dixon. He represented, well, Judy Kaler represented part of that area, but this guy represented Dixon. And so I can always remember that Judy Kaler was kind of pushy and up front, and I think she ended up being a judge someplace. But she was, one of the people that gave her salary back and all this kind of stuff, and played the game. And when Reagan came to Dixon, she pushed herself up on the platform. She had a red dress and stood in front of everybody. And this guy who was the old, kind of a curmudgeon of a state rep, he was just so upset because Judy Kaler came to his hometown and stole all the thunder when Reagan was there to speak in his hometown of Dixon, Illinois. And I'll think of what this guy's name is in a while, but he was a Dixon guy, good guy.
I know you had a chance to meet him later on. Did you meet him at that time during that election?
No, I couldn't even get on the stage.
Okay, well that gets us to the last legislative term, 85 and 86, at least the last term while you were in Illinois. And I'm not sure exactly when this started, but I did want to ask you about Jim Thompson's big initiative, Build Illinois. and just have you reflect on that and how it impacted you personally.
Yeah, I'm a little fuzzy on that. I think he was doing a lot of things. I mean, he was trying to build Illinois, so he was trying to get the money to do a lot of the road work. And one of the things you had to do, almost everything the state did, a state put in $1 and the feds put in $4. So if you had guys like Rostenkowski and others who were actually putting some money in the highway bill for the state, and he had a hotshot highway commissioner. I remember public director of, I say Secretary of Transportation. I don't remember this guy was, but he was good at getting federal dollars. So what Thompson had to do was to get enough money, capital money raised so that they could do the federal matching funds. So it was $1 a state for every $4 that you brought in. And it was for rail in Chicago. It was for commuter transportation. There's a lot of CTA stuff and RTA stuff going on at the same time. I was kind of in the periphery of that. We had RTA and CTA. RTA that came out, the trains and stuff that came out in our area. But it wasn't something that I was really, wasn't my area to focus on. And so he was trying to get the capital and then had to raise the taxes to do it.
When you're talking about this, you're talking about public works projects, you're talking about big investment, buildings and roads, as you mentioned before. And here's the question I got for you, I guess, Mr. Speaker. At that time, and certainly it's going to play out at the national level as well, what was your attitude about bringing money back to the district? What if it's somebody else's district, it's pork. If it's your district, it's probably called investment.
Look, my view is that if you're working your streets every day and you're talking to the people, the county commissioners and the county board members and the people who are trying to make local government work, people who have to take care of the police departments have to take care of a four-way stop when it should be a stoplight, and you have a lot of traffic, and they understand that. They understand it better than some guy sitting in Springfield or Washington trying to scribble on paper and make decisions. So I think an elected representative owes it to his district to go to wherever where his base is, to whether it's Springfield or Washington, and try to make sure that his district gets the things that people tell him it needs. And you go through the test to make sure it does. But I think that's a way that you ought to go. And I've taken issue with these guys that were, quote unquote, anti-earmarks. Now, some people take advantage of earmarks, and some people, if you're on the right committee, get more earmarks than they should. But basically, if you're willing to put your name on it and stand in an election for it, it should be okay. If it's something you don't want to take credit for, then it shouldn't do it. One of the things I wasn't involved, it wasn't my district, but a typical thing was, for all the time I was in the legislature, they tried to get Route 39. You just drove down on. It used to be Route 51, and 51 kind of parallels it and kind of winds through LaSalle, Peru, and goes up through Rockford and went down to Clinton, Illinois.
Is that a U.S.?
It was a state, well, it was U.S. Route 51, but it was a two-lane highway.
Mm-hmm.
And so what Kaler and a lot of those people, Sam Vincent, a lot of those folks were trying to get 51 changed to Route 39, U.S. 39, to make it a state. So you had to build bridges across the Illinois River. And
you mean Interstate I-39?
Interstate I-39. So this was a big issue. Well, Build Illinois was part of that. And you had to build the bridges. You had to have the federal matching, you had to have the state matching funds for the federal dollars. So, I mean, that is a case in point of what Build Illinois was all about. Well, what did it do? It connected a route to Wisconsin all the way down through the middle of the state, and connected a lot of the interstates that go east and west, including I-55. So it was an important, I-80 and 88 and everything else. So it's an important road, and especially for those people who lived in Rockford and Rochelle and Mendota and Bloomington and Clinton, Illinois. It's an important thing to have.
Okay. What I want to do next is just run down some of the other prominent personalities in Illinois politics during the time frame you were at the Illinois legislature. and just ask you to reflect on them a little bit more. Quite a few of these people we talked about already, so I won't dwell on them. But you've mentioned Jim Riley a few times. Did you have a lot of dealings with him?
Yeah, matter of fact, I know Jim Riley pretty well because I told you John Halleck had this house that he lived in, and John lived downstairs, and there were 2 bedrooms and a bath upstairs, and Riley and I rented the 2 bedrooms. So we're actually housemates, so I got to know Jim pretty well. But also a seatmate, and I thought he was a very capable person. And he represented Jacksonville, Illinois, but he was also a person that had his fingers in a lot of Illinois issues. And he had the trust of the governor, and the governor eventually asked him to become deputy governor, eventually chief of staff. But Jim, when I worked with him, was a very even-tempered guy. And we used to had an in with the Chinese restaurant. I forgot what one in Springfield, but he used to go out and we'd have dinners, and he'd get the guy to make up a special meal, and we'd bring a lot of people in. Everybody would dole in $10 or whatever, have a great China. But maybe he'd do stuff like that. But Jim, I got along with Jim real well.
You mentioned he was even-tempered. I have heard that he had a bit of a reputation when he was chief of staff for both Thompson and then later on for Edgar. He could be the guy who would make his presence known, to be a little bit of the enforcer.
I think I had a chief of staff who I thought was a great guy, but sometimes he had to lose his temper. That game is sometimes good cop, bad cop. And your chief of staff had to tell the bad news, you get to tell the good news.
So all you're saying is that Riley was an effective chief of staff? Is that?
I wasn't there that much
Okay.
when he was chief of staff, but I think Jim was probably very effective because he kept the job, and not only one governor but 2 governors. So.
Okay. You've mentioned this next one quite a bit as well, but during the time you were at the state legislature, Jim Edgar was Secretary of State. Did you have a lot of dealings with him in that capacity?
Not really. He was there. He was the Secretary of State. He came out of the legislature, but he had left the legislature by the time I came. But Thompson picked him. He didn't run for election. He was appointed Secretary of State.
Okay. And the next one is the mayor of Chicago. And during the time you were in the legislature, there was a couple, but Richard M. Daley, and maybe you had more dealings with him once you got out to Washington, D.C.
Yeah, my mentor, a guy named Dallas Ingemanson, we talked about before, was a state prosecutor. He was a state's attorney. Well, Daley, for most of the time that I was in the legislature, was the Cook County state's attorney. And so he and Dallas were associates and friends. I think Dallas was president of the State's Attorneys Association, so Daley was involved with that. So I got to know Daley a little bit through that connection. But we really didn't have a lot of workings together. I really didn't have a lot of stuff I had to deal with the Cook County State's Attorney, thankfully. But he made a record for himself, and of course, got into this race against Harold Washington, where we lost, and so it was a question whether he could come back or not, and he eventually did. But after Daley's dad died in '76, I believe, you had Blandick, and then you had Jane Byrne, and not necessarily in that order, and then Harold Washington. But I think Chicago was pretty much in flux. I don't think any of those people were really able to deal with the city council, which was a game in itself. And a lot of those people were still pretty much loyal Daley people. But they juggled around the people and juggled around who had to do what. I remember, for instance, there was a change of Jane Byrne to Blandick, I think, or I'm not sure exactly, but Jimmy Bulljive Taylor got pulled out of the Senate, put back to the House, and some of those people had coattails. Somebody always had a Chinaman connected to one of those guys.
Ed Madigan.
Ed Madigan, the Ed Madigan was a congressman.
Yeah, not at the state level. Then most of his
he came out of the state level. He and Henry Hyde actually drew were the Republicans that drew the map in 1972.
Any relation to Mike Madigan?
No, not at all. Matter of fact, Ed Madigan's dad was a horse trader from Lincoln, Illinois, and Tom Ewing's father was a horse trader from right down there, Atlanta, I think, was a little town they're from. But they knew each other from boyhood. But they were both, their father were both horse traders, and had racing horses and all kinds of things. So they would tell all kinds of stories. And, Madigan rose to, well, he came to the state legislature. He and Henry Hyde drew the map in 1972 and drew them both congressional districts and ran for the Congress. Henry also ran for the speaker's job and lost, and so was, in a sense, was kind of a persona non grata. So his great escape was to leave the legislature and go to Congress.
Yeah, and that's probably a story that is better picked up once you start talking at the national level.
Yeah. Well, I don't. It happened when I was in the legislature, or before I got to the legislature. So it's just an aside. But I tell you, it shows you what, if you have the crayon for reapportionment, it makes a lot of difference who does what. Ed Madigan was a guy that I knew. I got to know him better when I went to Congress.
Okay. Judy Bar Topinka.
Judy came in with me, and Judy, dealing with Judy was like dealing with a ringmaster of a circus. And I remember when we got sworn in, she must have about 3 or 4 busloads of people down from Cicero and Berwyn, which were her district. A lot of ethnic people, and Judy would be talking in tongues with these people. I mean, talking in their language, and it was Judy everywhere. And I remember one time I was a state rep and I went to do a parade in Lisle, Illinois, which I had just a piece of Lisle, a small piece of Lisle, but Judy had a piece of Lisle. And so, I had a Jeep or something, so I'd ride in the Jeep and wave to people. Judy had a float, and Judy had a band, and Judy had 50 people all dressed up in costumes, all running around her, and of course, it was a production. And that's just how Judy was, and but she was certainly a character. She was certainly a caricature of herself.
Here's another very prominent female legislator, Dawn Clark Netsch. She was spent most of the time in the Senate, but I think.
Yeah, but she was in the Senate all the time. I was there, but Dawn was. I did a lot of revenue stuff with her. She was smart. She was fair. She wasn't that partisan, only when she had to be. She was really one of the people I worked with very closely when I did the Public Utility Act. She was smart enough to get it and understand what was going on, and she had the lawyer's background, so she was judicious in doing it. She also did a lot of the revenue stuff that I did, so our paths crossed a lot, and I had a very close and long relationship with her.
Okay. The next one, Neil Hartigan, was Edgar's opponent in the 1990 gubernatorial election, but he had been Attorney General for 8 years during the time that you were there.
Yeah, and you know what? He succeeded Ty Fainer. So Ty Fainer was Attorney General for part of the time that I was there. And then Hartigan came in. But I really didn't have much to do with Hartigan. You had 2 Democrats that were pretty prominent. I'm trying to think. One was a guy that was from downstate Illinois, and he was a senator, and then he became the treasurer. And then Neil Hartigan was the
You talking about Jerry Cosentino?
Jerry Costino. Jerry was a trucker from the suburbs.
James Dunawalt.
Dunawalt, yeah.
Okay.
So I got to know Hartigan later, but I really didn't know him very well when I was in the legislature. Can't really tell you much about him.
Okay.
He was, he's a Chicago guy, part of the operation, part of the group.
Any others that
Southside Irish.
Anybody else that you want to mention? You've talked about so many of these people, and maybe some that have become more prominent after you left, but you recall from those days?
Well, I just have to go. Tom Ewing, when I first came to the legislature, I was pretty much a neophyte, but Ewing was a guy who kind of, one of my mentors. I've had a lot of mentors, but Ewing was a guy who just took the time, befriended me. I was sat in the same row. I don't know if it was exactly next to him, but I sat in the same row to him after the first term, and it really became a friend. And I worked with him on legislation, and this farmland assessment bill was one of them, and other things. But Tom was a guy who was a mentor to me, and I think taught me an awful lot.
Okay, one other then. Roland Burris, who was the controller for quite a few of those years.
Yeah. You know what? Again, came out of the Chicago operation. He was there. Controller. Nobody could quite ever figure what the controller did as opposed to the treasurer. And you know, he showed up from time to time, but you know, nobody really. I couldn't tell you what he really did, and really didn't have much of an effect, I don't think, during that period of time.
Okay. Well, that gets us up to, I want to ask about the 1986 election, but before we launch into the discussion about your election, because that's an important year for us, wanted to ask you about state level elections, and let's start with the primary season and the state race. Jim Thompson, Adlai Stevenson, but that primary election, as you'll recall, was the year that the two LaRouches ended up emerging after the primaries. And for Lieutenant Governor, James Fairchild won. He was a LaRouche candidate. And for Secretary of State, Janice Hart.
Yeah, I think George Sangmeister was the guy that, on the Democrat side that was a candidate, was a slated candidate.
George Sangmeister got beaten, yeah, in the primary.
Was that for Lieutenant Governor or for Treasurer?
That was Lieutenant Governor. Ariel Puczynski lost for the Secretary of State.
So anyway, that was a real shakeup, and it you know, in a race that could have been close because of the non-presidential year, it kind of really decimated the Democrats.
It could have been close for Adlai Stevenson, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, he could have won it. I remember walking around it, and I was a precinct committeeman, so I had to walk around for petitions for Thompson. And Pop said, "Oh, yeah, I saw him at the barbecue or barbecue, and he had barbecue on his face, or, you know, I saw him and he didn't talk to everybody in the room, or you know, people had lame excuses, Republicans, for not supporting Thompson. They didn't want to sign the petition. So I don't, you know, Thompson had been there for by the time 6 or 8 years at that point, and he's starting to wear on people a little bit. Oh, he ended up being there for another, you know, 4 or 6 years. But
well, that would have put him at the 10-year mark, right?
Yeah, and so, you know, 10 years is a long time for somebody to be in the same spot. And so he, you know, I think that could have been a lot closer election, or maybe a Democrat victory if it wasn't for the LaRouche thing. But I remember it, and I was unopposed, so I was a good observer at that time.
It's one of those things that makes Illinois politics especially interesting to watch.
For sure.
How did it end up that, were you starting in the year 1986 thinking you're going to run for re-election at the state level?
I did. Ran for re-election, won the primary, unopposed in the primary, unopposed in the general. So I had a free ride. You know, I was doing well in the legislature. And then, you know, in 1982, my state rep seat, as you know, went from a multi-member, but it was cut into 3 different congressional districts. And usually, you know, a congressional district is over 500,000 people, and a House seat was 100,000 people. So, you know, usually a congressional district contained a lot of different House seats. It was self-contained in a congressional. But all of a sudden, my House seat was split up into 3 different congressional districts. I had a kind of Kane-Kendall district. I had a district that was stuck in, it had part of Naperville and DuPage County. That was I'm kind of early. A guy named John Erlenborn had that district. John Grotberg won that district from when Tom Corcoran left and ran against Percy Grotberg, who was my kind of predecessor and also a mentor of mine. When I served him when he was in the state senate, when I was teaching school, I told you I was in that Taft Institute or Sangamon University's Sangamon State program, and so Grotberg had the congressional district to the north, which include where we're at right now in Kane County and DeKalb County. And then a guy named George O'Brien had the district to the south, which included most of Will County, and then it went all the way into the city and took in the 10th Ward and went all the way to the lake along the Indiana border. And so what happened is that in May, O'Brien was sick. Everybody knew O'Brien was sick, but nobody knew how he had cancer. Nobody but knew how bad he really was. But I started, a guy named Hank Banzer, who was the chairman of Kane County, was kind of O'Brien's guy around Aurora area, the east side of Aurora, because Aurora was split up. And all of a sudden, Banzer started going to all these political meetings in place of O'Brien. I'm thinking, that's not right. Then all of a sudden, a state senator from the south side started showing up. And this is strange. Somebody's lining somebody up to run. And I didn't know how bad that O'Brien really was. But then Grotberg came down with a stroke. I think it was a stroke. He was getting some kind of, what happened, he had some kind of disease, I forgot what it was, and he was going to the National Institute of Health in Washington, and evidently got a dirty needle or something, and ended up with a blood clot in his brain. So Grotberg was paralyzed. He was in a bed and in some kind of an induced coma. And O'Brien was dying of cancer. And so sometime in May, I don't know what the exact date was, but within 3 days of each other, these two guys resigned their nomination. They already had the nomination for their office. Now, O'Brien was opposed by a guy from Joliet, and Grotberg was opposed by a woman who was the coroner in Kane County, Mary Lou Kearns, Kearns, I believe. And so Grotberg was kind of dismissive of Kearns. Grotberg had won. He was sure he was going to probably win again. And I think his staff kind of thought, well, if Grotberg, they could put him in the back of a convertible by the 4th of July and get him in the parades, he's fine. He'll be better, and they could win the race. Well, what happened? He didn't get better. And matter of fact, they pulled him out of the race. And so there was a lot of jockeying around, and I decided, look, if I'm ever going to run for Congress, here's 2 congressional seats that just open up in my own state rep district. And what I had the biggest percentage of was the Will County district, but Jack Davis, who I mentioned before, sat behind me. He was also a candidate for speaker against Lee for leadership against Lee Daniels. He was the secretary of the Will County party. Well, Jack decided he was going to run for Congress. So, and he was going to run in the Will County spot. So if I was going to run and not go against somebody who's already ensconced in the biggest county in the district, I'm going to have to go into Grotberg. But it was better for me because that's where my home was. That's where I went to school. That's where my folks lived. That's where our family had a rep. Of course, we had a family name in Joliet area too because of the restaurant business. But that was an area that I was very comfortable in.
Got a couple maps here of the district. I got this from the Illinois Blue Book. I understand it was the 14th
14th congressional district.
14th congressional, and I think it's probably a little bit on both.
Yeah, here's
maps.
the 14th here. See, so it started all in Algonquin and went all the way down. Oh, this is it. It was the North and South district.
But I think some of it is on this map, Mr. Speaker, as well, because it spills over into the collar counties as well.
Yeah, here's the 14th here. So it just lays here. This is what you're seeing right here. See this little indentation there.
Before we get too much farther, I wanted to ask you this. The way you've described it, I guess my question is, why did you have aspirations to move to the federal level?
Well, yeah, I really did. Yeah, but when I wrote the Public Utility Act, I remember went out to Williamsburg. There was a conference out there. And, even when I was a kid, I would go to Washington, and I had an aunt living in Washington. I remember 2 times I went out there. And, I would get a kick of just going up the hill and walking around and going, sitting and listening to hearings and going to watching the Senate work and watching the House work. And I taught economics and taught government, taught history, so I was, I wouldn't say a student of all this, but it was something that I had a passion for. I liked. But I never thought that as a school teacher. Well, first of all, as a kid from the cornfields, I always said, and never had any money, and so I really didn't have any power. I had an education, got a master's degree in education, but what was that? And so I never really thought that I had the political power to be able to run for Congress. But I was surprised. I didn't know if I had the political power to be in the legislature, but I found out once you're in the legislature, for what you may not have in political clout outside, you were able to make up for if you just worked hard. But so I didn't know, but I thought, what, this brass ring only comes around if I don't grab it. I'm not sure if I'm ready to run for Congress or not. I've only been in the legislature for 6 years, but I've had a lot of experience. I did all the appropriation stuff. I did revenue stuff. I wrote 2 pretty significant pieces of legislation. So, I've done the stuff that makes up legislation, and that's what you do in Congress. I think I went to Congress. I lobbied not lobbied, but I met and talked to people about the National Sports Act. So I knew what I knew there were good congressmen. I also knew that there were people that not sure they're any better than anybody else.
Does that mean when you started your career in the Illinois State Legislature, you never really seriously thought that this is a stepping stone to something larger?
I never dreamed. It was just, I ran kind of on a lark when I decided it was an opening I was going to run. So I never had any long-term plan, and step by step. So when I talked to Gene and talked to a couple of my friends, Tom Ewing being one of them, and he said, go for it. And so I did.
You're in an institution, though, where you're surrounded by an awful lot of other people who, let's say, are very ambitious, driven people.
Yeah.
You wouldn't describe yourself that way?
I really wouldn't. Anything I ever done, I just kind of happened into it. I mean, whether I went to the legislature, when I went to Congress, it was something that opened up. And so I didn't go through a nomination, or I didn't go through a primary. I went to a convention. And that's how I was chosen. So all of a sudden I got on the phone, I had 500 precinct committeemen I had to line up. And, Dallas Ingemunson, again, who was my mentor and helped me in the legislature. He was state county chairman. He had a lot of influence in some of these other counties. A guy named Ed Thornton, who was the Edmund, E-D-M-U-N-M-O-N-D, Thornton, who was the county chairman in LaSalle County. He had connections with. All of a sudden, I didn't have Will County anymore. Kane County, he had connection, and the guy who was the chairman of Will County, Republican chairman of Will County, was a guy who fancied himself to go to Congress. I mean, that's what his intentions were. So he was out there, and he had the mayor of Elgin who wanted to do it. He also had a guy who was the clerk in Kane County. He was looking at it, and all these people. So I just started lining up precinct committeemen. And another guy named Tom Johnson, who had ran against Grotberg, he was thinking about it. He was over in West Chicago. That was the DuPage part of it.
Which is a pretty good power base to launch from in
yeah.
DuPage County.
Yeah, and he was an attorney, and he had ran against Grotberg and narrowly lost in the primary. And but I had some people in his hometown that, matter of fact, they happened to work for Commonwealth Edison. Another gas company people, but people that had worked on the utility legislation. And they were all supporting me, and they were precinct committeemen. And all of a sudden, I just kept working this, and these guys started dropping off. So I ended up going to the convention. It was me and the mayor of Elgin, and I just had done a lot more legwork.
You mentioned Dick Larson and Dick Verbeek.
Yeah, Dick Verbeek was the mayor of Elgin, and Dick Larson was the county chairman of Kane County.
And is this district, once you get past the primary, it's a pretty safe Republican district?
No, it's a district that, in 1974 it went Democratic, so it wasn't absolutely safe. The Democrat had it, and then Tom Corcoran beat him. But, so, it was a district that could swing. But it was a pretty good district. It was a pretty good suburban district. I remember we went into this race, and Mary Lou Kearns was already there. And I said that she had the writer for the Tribune. I should never forget his name, but I have. You know, she had a kind of a liaison with him, and she was just a character. She had these romantic things going around. A couple of judges in Kane County, you know, she had affairs with. So I had a radio guy in Elgin. She must have liked media people, and you know, so she had all these boyfriends around. And
was she married?
No, but she was very seriously dating this guy who she had broke up his marriage, and so, but you know, I remember David Axelrod was her media person, and Rahm Emanuel was assigned from the DCCC to be her person. And so, you know, all of a sudden I had Rahm Emanuel in my district and David Axelrod doing the press. And, you know, I couldn't get anything in the Tribune, a decent article in the Tribune at all, because this other guy was not, first of all, the Tribune guy was her friend. And we had Axelrod feeding all kinds of stuff. And all of a sudden the thing was, I was a friend of utility companies because I had written the Public Utility Act. You know, they had this ad on "Thank you, Denny" with a cash register going in the back, and so it was an interesting a race. But you know, I started out with zero name recognition. My state rep district, what I had was about 4% of the congressional district. So, you know, and you didn't get any Chicago coverage, so you really didn't have any, you know, big coverage from TV stations. As opposed to if you're down in Pontiac, Illinois, Tom Ewing, he had 3 stations that every time you walked out in the cornfield, they were all there on TV taking them. So we had a district that you had to win by basically knocking on doors. Kearns was from Kane County, which is the largest county in the district, so she had been elected there numerous times as a coroner, so she had a proven track record of politically. And it was a tough race, and I think I won that 52-48. I think that was the number, something like that. And we didn't know until, you know, the night of the election whether I would win this thing or not.
I wanted to quote the book here, and you're talking about a Chicago Tribune reporter. Is this the one who was close to Kearns?
Yeah.
That the same piece.
I couldn't say everything in my book because I was still speaker, and I needed to be careful of what I said.
But anyway, this is what you said. No matter what I said, the Chicago Tribune reporter recycled the same piece almost every day about how this, quote, evangelical wrestling coach wanted to go to Congress.
Yeah.
Did they define you as an evangelical because they thought that would work against you?
Well, you know, try to write me down to the far right, political right. And
is that how you saw yourself?
Not really. I guess you would define me as evangelical, but I never put that. No, that was never part of my political agenda. So.
And the other thing I wanted to mention when we're in the same neighborhood, the quote that you've got here about David Axelrod and Rahm Emanuel. The Democrats showed that they didn't know who they were dealing with when they charged that I was a captive of and beholden to special interest groups.
Yeah. No, I tell you, the biggest problem I had in writing that legislation because the interest that the Chicago machine had in Commonwealth Edison. So, you know, I think probably was it a perfect piece of legislation? No, it was a good piece of legislation, yes. But the things that were imperfect was because where Chicago was beholden to, so you had Madigan and the Democrats and Rock and others, you know, really threw a Commonwealth Edison under the table, some bones. And so, you know, they're saying, well, I think those bones happened because I was beholden to it wasn't me, it was the Democrats. But, you know, I got blamed for it.
I was going to say, the legislature at the time that was written was controlled by the Democrats, and you said McPike was it was a bipartisan effort, as you described it?
Well, McPike did most of the telephone stuff. He wasn't that big on the utility side.
Let's talk about fundraising a little bit, because now you're in a different realm, I would think, from the state legislature.
Well, they told me, you know, when I got into it, they said, look, you're going to have to raise $500,000 before October. And to me, you know, I think the most I ever raised in the state legislature was $12,000 to run. and I had a little bit in my campaign, not very much, but that was state. You had to separate your state dollars from your federal dollars because you couldn't use state dollars. There was a different type of election law, and so it started from I couldn't even base. So, I was out trying to raise money, and so you had to go to PACs, you had to go to organizations, and it was always a story that I told that there was this guy Howard Lerner, Leaner, and he was one of Quinn's guys, and he was a decent guy, but he was always testifying, and he was an activist, and he was a consumer activist, and kind of in the thing of who the guy who ran as a Green Party candidate all the time, Nader type, and but I got always along with Howard. Well, the funny thing is when I started going around to interview, and I had done a lot of work with the Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. I think Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. I think that BEC or whatever the acronym is, IBEC or something, whatever it is, Illinois Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. Because they were involved with the plants. Of course, they were all Democrats, but that was their jobs. They were the guys who were building these plants and running the plants for Commonwealth Edison. So we worked with them a lot because they had technical knowledge on how things work. So I went to get their endorsement. Well, I walked into the door of this building in Chicago. I didn't know what building I was in. There was Howard Lerner. I said, Howard, what the hell are you doing here? Well, I represent the Illinois Associated Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. I said, well, I'm asked for the nomination, but I said, I don't know what kind of dialogue. He said, we don't have to talk about it. You're not going to get the nomination from these guys. I said, okay. Well, so the next, that was a morning. The afternoon, I went to another place and to do an interview for the Chicago Teachers Association. Chicago, not the Illinois Education Association. I've always been nominally supported by them because I was a teacher and I did a lot of, I did the higher ed appropriations and those types of things. So I went to do the interview when I walked in the door, there was Howard Lerner. I said, Howard, you're all over the place. You're ubiquitous, and he just laughed. We always had that kind of, but that was just how they worked, and so raising the money was a frustrating thing, and already they were supporting Mary Lou Kearns, because he was a Democrat, and so you went and you got some PAC money, and you went to Washington. I remember I'm going in to meet this lady who was an independent business person, I think, and I walked in the door, and she looked at me, and she's kind of a little gal, but a little woman, and she says, well, it's your dime. What the hell you got to say? Wow, this was really tough to raise money, but I did. I also mortgaged our house for $20,000. Didn't tell my wife, but anyway.
Was she otherwise supportive of your decision?
She was. She said, if this is what you want to do, go ahead and do it. And Jean's always been supportive, never asked any questions, and always been a saint. She's been kind of took care of the kids, and when I wasn't home 3 days a week, and took care of things.
As the Republican, I would think union money would be thin, but you also were a teacher and a wrestling coach. Did you have any support from the teachers union?
No, I just told you.
And how about the National Education Association? You got an interesting story in the book about going to them, I think.
Yeah, I remember going to them and going to a conference, and the people who were asking the questions were also on Mary Lou Kearns' campaign committee.
Okay. Well, the story you mentioned in the book was that they were interested in things other than what you were interested in.
Their issues were all kinds of issues that weren't necessarily education issues, ERA and all kinds of things. So,
did you get any help from the Republican Party?
Yeah, I got a little bit of help, but back then, when I was there, we raised a lot of money, and even now, it's unbelievable how much money they raise and really put into the system. It's more like a Madigan system. But we raised a lot. But back then, we got a little help, but she didn't get much.
Do you recall if the president or the vice president came into Illinois to help anybody? Vice
President would have been Bush. I think they both came, but I'm not sure it was. I don't think I had any specific help from me. I'm sure I did.
Okay, I'm going to stop for now because we got to change the disc here, and I'll be right back at it. Okay, I wanted to change gears here a bit and ask you about the issues during that campaign. And maybe this is a good time to kind of get an assessment of where you were in your own political career and your philosophy by that time. So let's talk about fiscal issues, and how would you have presented yourself fiscally at the time?
Well, I think I was pretty much, I came out of the Appropriations Committee, so you're somewhat from some folks who are always suspect because you're spending money. I was also on the tax side, so I did a lot of stuff with Ewing that brought our tax system in Illinois pretty much in line with what Reagan wanted to do. But I found out that there were a lot of people out there that were far to the right, and and there were some moderates in our party, and it was even more so at that time. But really the party played an influence too, because you really had to work with precinct committeemen and people who were party officials. I told you after the McCain-Feingold bill, I mean, that all kind of changed, but the party did have a role. And so you campaigned with party people, you campaigned with precinct committeemen, you went to factories, you shook hands, you exposed yourself to union workers, because you knew a lot of those people were people that liked to have their firearms and liked to hunt, and they also knew that a lot of them were conservative, socially conservative, and fiscally conservative as well. They were the old Reagan Democrats, and so you went everywhere, and even sometimes it was uncomfortable to go because you didn't get a lot of support there, but you had to do it.
What were some of the places?
Well, some of the, working factory gates. It was always an experience.
How about foreign affairs? That would have been a new area for you.
Yeah, and it was also an area that I couldn't say I knew a lot about, and so I knew a little bit about regulation, and I knew a lot about taxation. I knew a little bit about spending. I could talk about those things. But foreign affairs, those types of things, I kind of deferred to guys like Henry Hyde and others who were involved with it, that knew it.
Were you comfortable with President Reagan's position on the Soviet Union? He had defined them as the evil empire.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting because Reagan was kind of a hero of mine, and I was kind of was privileged to serve in his last 2 years to get to know him a little bit, but also it was a tough 2 years. You had the Iran-Contra thing going on and all this stuff, and the Democrats were having they had a majority in the Senate, so they're having all these blood hearings against them, majority in both houses actually, and where Reagan prior to '86 had I think he had the Senate. He lost the Senate in '86, I think it was '86. So anyway, yeah, I thought Reagan, I used to remember giving speeches in Dixon after I became a member of Congress, during I was Speaker. I'd talk about how the liberals would kind of hiss through their teeth when he would talk about the evil empire or Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall. And they would say, where are you going? You don't want to upset the Soviet Union. You don't want to get these guys mad at you. And, it was kind of the whole liberal silk stocking group that said, well, you never want to, you want to appease, you don't want to challenge them. I always said, ironically, it was because Reagan did challenge him. And he never really, when he was in office, never really got to see that wall come down or all the changes that really happened in 1990. And Bush was there as president, but a lot of those things wouldn't have happened unless Reagan had the backbone to stand up and face him down.
Were you a supporter of I think it's Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars?
Yeah, I had a guy named John Kyle that came in with me, and right off the bat, I tell you, those things weren't expert issues. I really hadn't played on a national scene, but John Kyle was a member of Congress, came from Arizona, just retiring now as a senator from Arizona. But John was the guy who was for the Star Wars thing, and I got to know a lot about it after I got to Congress, but I really didn't know much of it before I got to Congress.
What were the main issues, as you recall, in that first campaign?
Look, it's who you are, getting to know people. It's more selling your person, I think, more than, that you'd go to Congress, you'd work, you'd listen to their concerns. I did a lot of stuff in healthcare. I didn't know anything about healthcare until I was in Congress for a couple of years. I first got on, I was on the transportation committee, so highways and railroads and that type of thing, I worked on it. Major first piece of legislation was to do away with the regulation on intrastate trucking, because the first couple of years they'd done away with interstate trucking, but we still had regulation intrastate. Interestingly enough, when it passed the Public Utility Act that I did, Democrats added on an amendment. I didn't even know. I mean, McPike did it, and I didn't even know anything about it. Really, they just attached it to the bill, and it was one of the provisions to just get the bill done. And it was on more state regulation. It was on regulation on trucking. And if you were going to truck a load of goods from Chicago to Carbondale, Illinois, it cost you more than if you would in-state trucking than moving stuff across the country, because the Interstate Illinois Commerce Commission set up all these rates and really prohibited competition from coming. So it was a regulation, prohibition. So I thought one of the things I could really change of what I thought was the fault in the Public Utility Act that I passed was this intrastate trucking regulation. And so basically I took it on as an issue, and that's one of the first issues I did in Congress. It was kind of a playback to what I had done in the legislature to try to clean up what we did, and we got it done.
How would you describe, you've been through a few elections by this time, how would you describe yourself as a campaigner?
Well, look I had a scheduler, and they made up your schedule. You're going to go this, you're going to LaSalle County, and then you're going to go to down to Streeter, and then you're going here, and you're speaking to this Rotary, and then you're going to talk to these, and then you're going to walk. So a campaign, you just did it. And I had somebody with me all the time, somebody to drive me. I was either on the phone trying to raise money, or I was out going from door to door, meeting people and getting acquainted. And I just spent a lot of time doing that.
At that time in Illinois, you talked about Jim Thompson already, but he was considered the master campaigner. Would you have tried to model yourself after him?
One of the things I learned a long time ago in coaching is I try to model myself after my high school coach. My high school coach was a great coach. He had a lot of influence on me, but I wasn't him. And so one of the things I learned, you got to be yourself. And if you're going to have success, you have to do it your way and not try to model someplace. And I wasn't Jim Thompson. I didn't have the presence. I wasn't the stature. He was just a different person. And so, look, I was Denny Hastert.
Getting close to November, late October, were you confident you're going to be able to be victorious?
No. Matter of fact, I really didn't know I was going to be victorious until the night of the election. It was a 52% win, and I didn't know who was out there. And I think there was a lot of Republicans who were in Kane County because you had a Kane County candidate. Really didn't say how they're going to. And we didn't really have. We had some polls, but we didn't have the polling that you have today.
Were you surprised when you ended up winning?
No, I was hopeful that we would win, and we did. And I wasn't surprised. I've always said that I was. People ask me. I said, "Well, I'm hopefully confident that we're going to do it." But when we did it, it was just we should have done it.
Do you remember the emotions when you figured out you'd won?
It was an emotional time. I was probably the most emotional time was when I ran in the legislature, because that was really I was teaching school and I was doing all those things at the same time, and that was really something I thought. So
an improbable story at that time?
Yeah. But, again, I was so busy running that fall that, I'll tell you another thing we did. We had this house over on Route 71 out of Oswego, between Oswego and Yorkville. Well, my house, I could have thrown quarters out of three sides of my house and been in a different congressional district. So they came in and picked up a thing right around my house. And so what I did is I had to move across the river. Where's that? Is there a map? Yeah, here it is, right here. So this little niche right here, right, you see right there, and where they split Oswego Township. And, you know, I lived here and I had to move there. I moved about 400 yards across the river. And so, you know, we were living in a house, we owned 2 houses, but we had actually moved, living in a house that was, you know, it was a cement block house. We were going to remodel it, but we had furniture stuffed into it. It wasn't very livable. But I remember living out of that and getting up in the, 6 o'clock in the morning and going campaigning and coming home at midnight, getting up and campaigning and coming home. It was a miserable time.
You didn't enjoy the campaigning side of politics?
It's hard work. Campaigning is really, really hard work. Especially, you know, what we're doing. We're out trying to get known and, you know, always had Democrats in your face and opposition, and Kearns had a pretty good campaign going. She had been on the ground for for almost a year before I got involved.
Okay, at this point in time, then I pretty much ended your Illinois part of the story of your career, and it's time now for the U.S. House people to pick up the rest of the story and your career that eventually is going to lead you to be the Speaker of the House, and I think had the longest tenure for any Republican as Speaker.
That's true. I outserved Joe Cannon, who was known as Czar Joe Cannon.
That was a name that you never earned, was it?
No. You know, you talk about TV and you talk about press and stuff a little bit, and my attitude about the papers. When I became Speaker, I followed Newt Gingrich, and Newt was always out there to TV and the press and talking all the time, and it always became about him. And you know, my coaching philosophy was that if your team was in the headlines every week, you're doing pretty good. If the coach is in the headlines every week, you're in trouble. So my view was to keep the head coach out of the headlines every week, and you know, do regular order. Let your chairman and your subcommittee chairman, you know, do the things. Let people have some success, and don't be stepping in on their message all the time.
You've already gotten into the area that I wanted to finish with. Let me start with this. Do you think your years in the Illinois State Legislature prepared you well to serve out in the U.S. Congress?
Well, it really did. Because first of all, you became a legislator. You knew how to legislate. You knew what you had to do. Now, you could legislate something in Illinois a lot quicker than you ever could legislate something in the Congress. But I also knew how to be effective in a minority. I mean, I worked both sides of the aisle. And when I was in the legislature, so I thought nothing about walking across and working on both sides of the aisle when I was in the Congress, which a lot of people didn't do. And I really knew what the hard work and the mechanics of getting legislation done. And so I wasn't afraid. I mean, I took on the trucking issue, the trucking dereg. Also took on the issue of earnings tests on Social Security, so seniors could work and not have to be penalized under Social Security $1 for every $2 they work, because all of a sudden you're creating a false economy. Seniors that work, they took the money out of the table. Why make them criminals, you know? So we changed that, the earnings test. But it took me 9 years to get that done. I started when I was a freshman. And I remember Rostenkowski going at a meeting with him, and he's sitting in his chair on a dais in his office. So he had his desk and his chair sitting up above, maybe 8 or 10 inches above everybody else. So you're sitting there looking up to Rostenkowski, and behind him was this picture of FDR with this picture light on it, and that was the only light in the room. So you had FDR illuminated behind Rostenkowski. Rostenkowski was a bigger-than-life guy anyway, sitting in front and glaring down at you. And I remember trying to talk to him about why we're trying to change Social Security. I think in his heart he really understood it, what we're trying to do. But he said, "You see this guy behind me?" He says, "You know, he did this Social Security thing, and God damn it, nobody's going to change it."
End of discussion?
End of discussion.
Did you find that your years in the Illinois legislature, did that kind of crystallize your political philosophy, or did it make you more pragmatic?
Well, I think I just think by nature I was pragmatic in a sense. but yeah, I was fiscal conservative and I was socially conservative, so I think that shaded my thinking all the time, and but I also understood that you had to work with who you had to work with, and I had when I was in the legislature, I had a lot of friends on the other side of the aisle. Jim Keene, who was on who was the revenue guy. We were good friends. We'd go out for dinner together. We have a few drinks together at night. Andy McGann, who was a funeral director out of the south side of Chicago. They're all these guys were Madigan guys, but they were socially conservative. They're good guys. The only difference we had usually was Chicago issues was the only issues different, and so there was probably a handful of guys of those types of folks that I became good friends with, and some of them are in the Senate from the south side of Chicago. So when I went over with a piece of legislation, along with people like Don Clark Netsch and others, I had friends over there. So somebody would help you with your legislation, as long as it wasn't blatantly partisan, which like Public Utility Act and a lot of this property tax stuff, those types of things didn't affect Chicago, so it wasn't blatantly partisan. So I had help on the other side of the aisle, and I had friends on our side of the aisle, obviously too. But you really were able to do things, and those are some of the treasured friends that I kept. I remember Jim Keene from time to time would come down to one of my fundraisers. I used to have a farm fundraiser out in Sandwich, Illinois, and he'd drive over from the south side of Chicago, and he thought he was driving to the end of the earth, And for a guy from the Irish and from the south side of Chicago, he probably was.
Okay. We've already talked about, you had busy years, the 6 years you were in the Illinois State Legislature.
I would say 5 years. The first year I was there, I was just trying to learn who they were and what I had to do and just trying to catch up. And I was on the Revenue Committee, I was doing a few other things, but I really got busy after my first year.
Are there one or two accomplishments that you're especially proud of?
I think the Public Utility Act was something that was really, it was revolutionary. It was changing. The Telephone Act was one of the first real different pieces of regulatory legislation that was done, set the tone for the rest of the country. And the things that I did in Congress after in the 90s I did on telecom regulation was just building off of what we really did in the Illinois legislature.
Any disappointments that you reflect back on?
Well, there's always disappointments. There's things that you think you needed for their district and you tried to work on. It just didn't happen, But
Any particular that you recall?
I've lost a few battles, not many. But I remember waking up in the middle of the night and thinking, I have this bill, and I have this bill, and I have this bill, and this bill. Where am I? Where are we on this piece of legislation? Have I done this work on this piece? I had a lot of stuff I'm trying to do. I had the appropriation process, and I had public utilities, and I had other pieces of legislation. I moved a lot of legislation. I don't want to blow my own horn, but I think I was named outstanding legislator a couple times during those years.
We touched on this already. The title of your book, 40 Years in Coaching and Politics, was coaching and teaching a good preparation to enter into politics?
I think teaching was because it gave you substance, and you learned through the process. I remember when I was teaching, I would take kids into California Avenue and take them in to see the criminal court arraignments. I saw kids in sociology. They'd never been to Chicago before. And here they're standing behind the judge, watching all these people up being arraigned for all kinds of crimes and how the system works. Well, you'd learn things too. I wasn't afraid to go do things and to learn the process. And so I did a lot of those kinds of things, and I think it was a good learning process for me as well. But coaching is a thing where you take a group of people, young people, and teach them a skill and give them the confidence and put them in a situation where they can be successful. And you're doing the same thing in politics.
Okay. Any final comments for us then today?
I think we covered the gamut pretty well.
We've spent quite a bit of time, and it's been a fascinating discussion. I want to thank you for that, and I look forward to hearing the rest of your story.
Okay. Well, here's the rest of the story.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
My pleasure. Thank you.